Everyone, can I welcome you to the 10th meeting in 2014 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Can I remind everybody to switch off their mobile devices as they do affect the broadcasting system, but some committee members may be consulting their committee papers on their tablets. The first item on the agenda today is an update from the Scottish Government on transport matters. For that, I welcome Keith Brown, Minister for Transport and Veterans, Aidan Grieswood, Director of Rail, and David Anderson, Head of Planning and Design from Transport Scotland and the Scottish Government. Minister, would you like to make some opening remarks?
If I could, Convener, thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to be before the committee again to provide an update on transport matters. If I could start off by mentioning the Scottish Government's capital investment programme for 2013. We estimate that will be around £3.2 billion, which we also estimate will support around 40,000 jobs across the economy, which is obviously good news for the economy generally, but also good news for the construction industry. We know benefits, the construction industry benefits in particular from certainty and the vision of the future as portrayed in the Infrastructure Investment Plan. And as we set out in our budget plans for 2014-15, we expect to see a further investment of over £8 billion in 2014-15 and 15-16. And that will be from a combination of the capital budget, the new borrowing powers which we would get in 2015-16, revenue-funded investment through the non-profit distributing programme, also the regulatory asset base, which obviously relates to rail projects, rail enhancements generally, capital receipts, and of course allocating some resource funding to capital assets. Obviously, if the result of the referendum is yes in September, then we would have the full prudent use of borrowing powers which nation states have, and we could bring forward, in our view, investment more quickly and making a very substantial difference to the economy both now and in the future. We've made significant progress in delivering our infrastructure investment plan over the course of the last year across all sectors, but in transport in particular, if I could mention the completion, for example, of the second of three major contracts required to deliver the fourth replacement crossing scheme, which include the M9 Junction 1A, the upgrade at £26 million, and the redevelopment of rail stations, also other aspects of transport policy, Dalmarnock in Glasgow at a cost of £12 million, Haymarket in Edinburgh at £26 million, and both of those, of course, are part of the Edinburgh to Glasgow improvement project. And there have been significant progress on the IIP programmes and projects in the transport sector elsewhere. The A9 dualling, Perth to Inverness, design, the draft orders for the 7.5 km section to be due between Kincraig and Dalradi were published in November, and design consultancy services, contract value around £120 to £180 million for the programme, are in procurement now. Also, the A96 dualling Inverness to Aberdeen design, preliminary development work and strategic environmental assessment work is underway along the corridor between Inverness and Aberdeen, and route option design work being progressed for the section of the A96 between Inverness and Nairn, including the Nairn bypass. To go back briefly to the fourth replacement crossing, I know that the committee received a specific update from the project team early in March. So I'll just restate the fact that the budget was reduced in September 2013 by £145 million to between £1.4 and £1.45 billion. And of course that relates to an opening tender band, if you like, of between £1.75 and £2.25 billion. And it remains on schedule for completion in 2016. I was there myself last week, and I think the committee is intending to go and have a look on site, and it is the scale of it is quite incredible. I'm sure you'll be impressed when you see it. Edinburgh to Glasgow rail improvements. The final business case for the programme has recently been published and is predicated on a capital outturn cost of £742 million for Phase 1, which will be fully delivered by March 2019. And as a precursor to the formal TOS process, Network Rail are currently consulting on the £120 million transformation of Glasgow Queen Street Station. In relation to Borders Rail, the project continues to make good progress and is on target against both budget and programme. Construction cost estimated at £294 million at 2012 prices, with service commencement planned for September 2015, although we continue to work with Network Rail to see if there's any way that can be brought forward. And the fares structure and timetable, which we published in late February, will ensure that the train will be an attractive travel option for travellers allowing them to go end to end in less than an hour and for under £10. The M8, M73, M74 bundle motorway improvements, the contract's recently been awarded at a significantly lower cost than the original expected cost. The project's expected to be completed in 2017. The next phase of the £40 million programme to upgrade the M74 between Junction 22 at Gretna and Junction 12 at Millbank is starting at the end of March. And when that full programme is complete, that will be 80 miles of new road surface, which is the equivalent of 200 football fields, for those who think in terms of football. The Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route, including the Balmedie to Tipperty section, this contract is currently in procurement with expected contract award later this year, in fact late this year. Construction expected to start thereafter and completion expected by spring 2018. Glasgow subway modernisation, up to £246 million. Scottish Government funding to enable SPT to deliver new trains, refurbish stations, upgrade signals and improve accessibility. Station refurbishment works have been completed at Partick on the platforms and at Ibrox and will be completed at Kelvin Hall before the Commonwealth Games starts. Glasgow's Fastlink, up to £40 million committed by the Government to fund the core scheme within the SPT business case. The infrastructure will be completed by mid-2014 and will be available for use in connection with the Commonwealth Games. On the A82, the improvements design development work is underway with designers appointed to develop a preferred scheme between Tarbert and Inverarnon by spring 2015. And construction has started in 2013, I think as Mr Ingram knows, on the A75 Drumnagget bypass, the A75 Hardgrove Kinmount section on the A75, the A77 at Simonton and Bog End toll improvements, which Mr Ingram knows about, and also the A82 Crane Larrick and A82 Pulpit Rock improvement, all of which are expected to be completed this year. Overnight construction works on the A82 Pulpit Rock improvement scheme have resumed this week until Friday. And also announced recently that Scotland's roads will get an additional £10 million upgrade as part of the 2013-14 budget. And in the north, the A90 at Stonehaven will be resurfaced. In the south, major repairs will be made to the Dumfries bypass. And in terms of bridges, works include upgraded parapets on structures from the A1 to the M90 and replacement bridge joints on the M8, M80, M9 and A90. Convener, late in February, announced 29 successful applicants to the Community Transport Vehicle Fund, which was recommended by this committee. And although a number of good applications were made, the fund was heavily oversubscribed, with 130 applications seeking a total of £4.1 million from what was a £1 million scheme. But new vehicles are expected to be in operation by the summer. I also know, Convener, the strong interest the committee has on active travel, and we're increasing investment in active travel by 50%, from £21.35 million for 2012-13, rising to £32.2 million in 2014-15. And in September we announced an extra £20 million over the next 2 years for a cycling infrastructure, and that additional funding includes the £3.6 million which will go to the Leith Walk active travel improvements with Edinburgh City Council, and local authorities will be given the chance to bid for the balance of £16.4 million through the Sustrans Community Links programme. I think it's worth pointing out that those programmes obviously have a much smaller scale than some of the previous ones I've mentioned, but they can have a disproportionately beneficial effect in especially rural areas because the contracts are smaller. They usually, or very often, are taken up by smaller local companies as well, and has a knock-on effect on local economies. Finally, following the recent landslide at the Rest and Be Thankful location, the old Military Road local diversion route was used for the first time. Members of the 83 Task Force held their first update meeting of the year on the 18th of March. And as the work around the Rest and Be Thankful nears completion, the netting installed in this area has already prevented debris from the hillside reaching the road. Investigations at other known high landslide risk areas on the A83 at Cairndow, just further on from the Rest, also at Glenkinglas and Loch Shira are ongoing, and we're looking at options to provide a similar mitigation at these locations. And budget discussions for the next financial year are ongoing in that regard, but this work is a priority, and for my part I want to see the level of momentum and commitment that we've seen on the 83 continuing in the near future. And my final point, Convener, would really be that if you look at that menu of different projects which are ongoing, I think that is part of a process which amounts to the modernisation of Scotland's transport infrastructure. I've not mentioned that much in relation to ferries or aviation, but I think those things which I have mentioned show there is, a substantive transformative change taking place in the infrastructure, and that's underpinned by the fact, as I've said before, that I think we have had underinvestment in the infrastructure for decades. It's not just me saying that. The Secretary of State for Transport, who obviously has forgotten that he used to be a Minister for Transport 1989 to 1992, he has said that recently as well. In fact, he's repeated it. So we are trying to make up from what was, I think, a low base, and we can't do everything at once. Obviously, we have to prioritise that. But I think there's evidence, even from what I've just listed today, of a major change, not least by having motorways or dual carriageway between all our cities, which I think most modern developed economies would expect to have. So I hope, Convener, that brief overview is helpful to the committee, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. And if Mary, you could start the questioning today, please.
Convener, good morning, Minister. Could you provide the committee with an update on the results of the Glasgow Airport Strategic Transport Network study, and whether the Scottish Government is committed to implementing the results of that study?
The recent study identified, it was led by the airport rather than the government, obviously, but and done in conjunction with ourselves and both Renfrewshire and Glasgow City Councils. It identified a number of things, including the short-term improvements which can be made in terms of bus. And we have said that we are supportive of that and have asked the various partners to take forward those measures, including a very fast link, bus fast link. I mean, these things have, the study showed, have not much risk attached to them, but major potential benefits. So with few risk implementation, it can be achieved at low cost. But I've also asked Transport Scotland, following on from the report, to work with the airport and the councils in considering further the feasibility of a tram train link from Glasgow Airport to the rail infrastructure. That was well received by the airport. Its cost-benefit ratio was substantial, so we think it could potentially produce benefits, although the report, I should say, has its limitations. It doesn't go into all the detail, and it does point out the fact that linking a light rail network into a heavy rail network is going to have its challenges. It did give 3 indicative routes, but it's not said what route it should be. So we did try to approach this with an open mind, and the airport themselves are very keen to have this option looked at, and so we said that we will do what we can to make sure that Transport Scotland, with their partners, look at it, see what can be done if it's a possibility.
The cost of that tram train link is £92 million. Are you able to break down that cost for us and tell us what's included in that £92 million?
Can I say, first of all, but saying that the cost of it is £92 million, I think from my experience has shown that I think the price first quoted for this Parliament was £10 million and it cost £432 million. Now, I'm not saying that's what's going to happen with the tram train link. All I'm saying is these figures, which are very provisional initially, and if you look at the report, they're saying that it's very indicative, and that's what they say it might be. And they haven't broken it down in the way that you would want to see happen as yet. We estimate it could be well short of that, it could go beyond that, and I think it's probably a bit invidious just now to put a specific price on it. But the main cost will be, of course, in the infrastructure which goes in there, and it's worth maybe mentioning as well that one of the attractions which, certainly when I read it, appeals to me is the fact that the light rail network, unlike the heavy rail option, can be much more flexible within the grounds of the airport, where space is really constrained. You can turn much more easily, and of course the cost and benefit ratio was better than the heavy rail option. So I think that price, I wouldn't want it ever to be fixed in the public imagination if we proceed down this path that was the price. It's very indicative at this stage, which is what we'd asked the study to look at. So I don't think we can be too specific on the prices yet.
Network Rail are doing a trial of tram trains in Sheffield and Rotherham, and that trial is due to start in 2016. If the trial would take, say, 2 years, and then by the time that trial is evaluated, what impact will that have on a potential tram train link between Glasgow Airport and Glasgow? And do you have any idea when potentially a tram train link could be started?
No, I think it's probably equally invidious to talk about dates in the way it is with prices just now, but I would say that what we've said is you have this initial study having been done which has showed it's a possibility and there are benefits associated with it. In fact, the cost-benefit ratio is a good one. I think it now, there's it comes down to the stage of doing it much more in depth. So the timeline for actually putting one in place, if that's what's agreed at the end of this further work, I think we'll be much more clear about then, but I don't think we want to be specific about it just now. I think what we do have to do is put some pace into it. I know the airport's very keen that we do start looking at this quite quickly and seriously, and that's what I've committed to do, but I wouldn't want to give a date to it just yet. We are aware of the trial, which you've mentioned as well. As you said, we can draw a lot from that, as well as other existing tram train links, which we're aware of as well. But I don't know if you think, if Aidan thinks there's anything further on the Network Rail initiative that we should mention.
No, other than, as you say, all relevant information, and that would include experience both on the technical side in terms of the feasibility around all of that, but also in terms of uptake and demand would all be relevant in terms of any appraisal of a tram train link to the airport.
Do you want to come in?
Yes. Could I ask about Prestwick Airport, Minister? You'd be aware that the Deputy First Minister was here last week giving us an update on what was happening there. I note your £3.2 billion capital programme. Is the investment that's going into Prestwick coming out of that budget, or is this a separate budget for Prestwick, given the circumstances of us, the government taking it on?
Well, it's coming from obviously government expenditure generally, and it's probably much for the Deputy First Minister and the Finance Minister to decide exactly where that comes from. But they've made the commitment to it, including the capital expenditure, which we think is necessary in order to stabilise and make more attractive the airport as a proposition for businesses, and that's where the bulk of the work is going on just now. You'll know about the appointment of the advisor that we have in place now. So the Deputy First Minister is very much in the driving seat in relation to this. So I think what she was managed to update the committee with last week is the latest position, including, as I read, the fact that she was not unmoved by the suggestion which you'd made yourself, Mr Ingham, about the naming of the airport. I think she may have mentioned that the removal of existing signs proved popular as well, but there is substantial commitment, and there has to be. I think the other point that the Deputy First Minister made, which I would reiterate, is that it is a long-term thing. It's quite clear from the challenges which face the airport that this will take some time to bring it around, but we're confident we can do that, whether it's through additional ancillary works or other developments of the airport. But there is substantial capital funding in place already for the airport in order to do that.
Robert Burns International would obviously be a nice marketing tool to be used. One of the areas that perhaps business at the airport has suffered from is the loss of a link to hub airports in and around London. Could you tell me, Minister, what the Scottish Government is doing on that front, not just for Prestwick, but for airports across Scotland, and what kind of progress you're making there?
Well, first of all, the Commission, I think, is about to, or may have already publicised its latest proposals, which supersede the old route development support framework, which was very popular and successful under the previous administration, but then ruled out by the European Commission. So that's what we've done, is to concentrate on those things which obviously fit with the Commission's guidelines. So it tends to be in terms of marketing to try and encourage routes. In relation to the hub airports, though, the two difficulties that we have, first of all, is access, where you have, for example, Heathrow and perhaps Gatwick seeing as much more lucrative the long-haul flights which come in, which can squeeze out not just Scotland but other parts of the UK in terms of hub access to Heathrow and these airports. And I've made representations myself to a number of UK Secretaries of State on that matter without, I have to say, success. What I have said is other European countries make sure that they have the connections into their hub airports. It's vital to them. But the other thing, of course, is air passenger duty as well. We've made the point before that we think this is a particular inhibition on routes from Scotland, and very often if you're going from Scotland to somewhere where you have to use a hub airport, you can be paying twice air passenger duty. We've seen, for example, the loss of a number of services, a potential loss through Flybe on the Inverness to Gatwick site, which we then stepped in to support there. We provided substantial support so that we've replaced those services and in fact improved them. Now, although you don't pay APD coming from Inverness, Flybe cited APD as a major reason, as well as the increased costs at Gatwick for using their facilities. And I've asked the UK government repeatedly, I've asked Dan Alexander repeatedly, and I noticed that he's on the flight, the first flight going down, when in fact he was cited as one of the problems with it, and we've managed to step in and help with that. But to go back to your point, APD and access to the hub airports, guaranteed access, as you say, I've not just met with the UK Secretaries of State, but also with the airports themselves and made this point to them. And obviously there's an element of competition just now between Gatwick and Heathrow, you know, this kind of the airports review. And I've said what Scotland is interested in, which passengers from Scotland are interested in, is getting access, obviously access at the right price as well. And they should really turn their minds to how they can best serve that. And if they don't, what you'll see, as I heard on the radio yesterday, was increasing advertisements for people to go to, I think it was New York via Dublin, or to go to Dubai via Dublin, and thereby save on APD, but also get that guaranteed access. So if they want to be the hub airport, they have to act like one, and that means servicing Scotland as well, and not having punitive taxes like the highest APD in Europe.
Am I right in saying that there were some changes to APD in the last budget, just last week, but it was for long-haul flights as opposed to the kind of links that you're talking about there? It seems a bit ironic.
Right, first of all, there was the increase. The further increases to APD rates was in the budget, but yes, you're right. The categories C and D, I think they're termed as, so I think including flights to Mexico. Now, there's not that many flights direct from Scotland to these locations, so it is a benefit, obviously. I mean, one of the examples I was given about the detrimental effect of APD was flights from Mexico no longer coming to the UK and choosing to go to Paris instead, for example, and the loss that we then suffer in terms of tourism. The York Aviation Report pointed out the loss there, but so it is a relatively minor change. It's good for those individuals, but it's got a limited impact, and certainly what we should be looking at is a major overhaul of the rates of APD in the first instance.
Okay, anything else on aviation, airports or anything? All right, if we move on to Caledonian Sleeper franchise, Alex?
Convener, I was going to take the opportunity to ask the Minister to give us a quick update on the franchising process for ScotRail and, of course, the separate Caledonian Sleeper franchise.
Both are going very well. I'll maybe ask Aidan to come in with the exact point of the process that we're at. We had a very good briefing very recently on the progress with the Sleeper franchise, which is more advanced as we'd programmed in the first place. Both are going very well. Both have shown healthy interest. We're down to 3 bidders in relation to the Sleeper service, and we have healthy interest in the main ScotRail franchise as well. So they're going as to plan. You may recall that we'd announced the process for the franchise, the letting of both franchises just in the aftermath, or really in the middle of the West Coast Main Line situation. So we'd been very aware of the need to make sure that we had planned this out with enough time and enough resource going into it. And that's, I think, borne fruit. But I don't know if you want to say more about the specific stages we're at with that, Aidan.
Not a huge amount more, just on the Sleeper. As the Minister said, we've got 3 bids, all of which meet the transformational objectives that we were seeking, and an announcement we made in the summer around the successful bidder for the Sleeper franchise. As the Minister said, we've programmed the bid process around the Sleeper and the main ScotRail franchise to ensure that we as an organisation, Transport Scotland, are properly adequately resourced in order to manage that process, but also to allow a longer mobilisation period for the Sleeper because of the transformational nature of the change that we're seeking through that procurement, in particular around the rolling stock and ensuring that you get best value out of the £50 million plus investment that we're going to get in terms of the rolling stock. So that's an important part of the process, and as I say, is factored into the timescale just to ensure that those passenger benefits come early. On the main ScotRail franchise, the timescale for that is we've got 5 shortlisted bidders, and the successful bidder will be announced in the autumn. And again, I confirm that That's fully on programme to timescale in terms of the process. And then with both franchises, new franchises, starting in April 2015.
Thank you. I had mentioned there of the £50 million. I've inquired after its well-being before. Of course, that £50 million was given by the UK government to upgrade the rolling stock and the sleeping service, I understand, on the basis of a matched funding arrangement. Can the Minister tell me where the money is currently resting, whether it's doing its job at the moment, and when it will actually be invested in rolling stock and the sleeper service?
I should say that the £50 million which Aidan mentioned isn't necessarily £50 million the UK government committed to it. We did agree to match fund it. But the way that it works, as I'm sure the member will know, is that we ask for the ITT, the invitation to tender, to specify what we want. The bidders are aware of the resource that we will apply to that, and they then make their bids on that basis. So we will pay the costs, the subsidy costs of the franchise over a period of time, and that will include the costs that they will take on for upgrading the infrastructure, which may be to some extent rolling stock, but other parts of the infrastructure as well to improve the service of the sleeper. So it's not like there's 50 million quid sitting there. It's applied as part of the process, and the bidders bid in knowing that resource is available, and they then say what they will do with that resource, as well as the additional resource which we will apply to fund the actual services themselves.
There's £50 million sitting somewhere at the moment.
There's a lot more than £50 million sitting in different places, but the money will be applied to this service. I mean, I'm not sure how, having seen some of the commentary, how else you could have done this. You couldn't have gone out and bought £50 million worth of rolling stock, because it doesn't exist. There is a long lead-in time for new rolling stock, if that's what happens, and we haven't specified that. That's what should happen. What we've said is we want to see a transformation in the quality of the rolling stock, so that could include refurbishment. It could potentially include new rolling stock, but that's up to the bidders to look at themselves. But the way that it's funded, and the way this £50 million and the much larger sum that the Scottish Government will put into this will be used, is to pay for the ongoing costs, as we do just now, for each year for the franchise, and that includes both the infrastructure costs and the services that are being run.
Thank you.
Okay, Mark, you've got some questions on Egypt.
Convener, Morning Minister. I wonder if you could tell committee why the cost of phase 1 of Egypt has increased by almost £100 million, up from the £650 million in 2012 to the £742 million figure we have now.
Well, there's two main reasons for that. The business case allows for costs of £742 million. That does now allow for prudential allowances of around £130 million for contingencies, which is a bigger figure than it was before. And that's partly to do with the comments of Audit Scotland and also with Treasury guidance. If you look at the contingency for example, HS2, I don't know, I think it's about 40% from memory of the actual cost of that. So the established guidance is to try and put in a substantial contingency to meet that potential additional cost. That's not to say we're committed to spending it. We'll try and reduce that, obviously. The basic costs have increased from £505 million to £560, and that's mainly because of additional investment in Queen Street Station. And what became obvious from the previous figures was that there is a bigger project which can be won at Queen Street Station, but it will include, for example, the purchase of additional or nearby properties in order to make that happen. So we think there's a much bigger prize here in terms of an iconic station in Queen Street, and the bulk of the costs, additional costs, are either for that additional quality of product at Queen Street. And if you've seen Haymarket Station, you'll see, I hope, what I mean by that. And the other side of the cost is the additional contingency which we put in there. We think the contingency may be a bit generous, but we think it's wise to put it in at this stage and try and work back from that rather than having to increase it as we go forward.
You touched on the Queen Street Station proposals. I wonder if you could give a timetable for the upgrade of Queen Street Station and the possible impact on passengers.
Well, we've said that we'll try and complete all of that, including the Egypt works themselves, by 2019. The possible impact, that's March 2019. The redevelopment of Queen Street Station completed by the end of Control Period 5, which comes to the end in March 2019. In relation to the impact on passengers, obviously this work will be carried out through Network Rail, and they're the experts in relation to this, and we've just made it clear to them, as we do with all these projects, that we want to make sure there's an absolute minimal disruption to passengers. We're not naive enough to believe that these huge transformative projects can be carried out without some disruption, but Network Rail can be very effective and are more effective at realising how to do this than we would be as to how they can minimise that. So what we have just now, for example, are discussions between the key stakeholders. Network Rail I've mentioned, Glasgow City Council, the Buchanan Partnership, obviously for the property I've mentioned, First ScotRail, SPT. They're all discussing ways in which the impact on passengers, you're going to have to shift trains, and some trains won't be able to get into the station as they currently do. We understand that point, but to make sure that's minimised as far as possible. And that's the way to do it, for them to get round the table to discuss that with the sole aim of minimising disruption.
I know the slab track replacement work isn't necessarily part of the Egypt programme, but will add to that disruption. Do you know if the slab track replacement and the tunnel closure at Queen Street will coincide or overlap at all with the Winchborough tunnel closure?
Well, the slab track, the maintenance, which has to be done to the tunnels, which is Network Rail's responsibility. They have the overarching responsibility to undertake these works. It is their responsibility, and we are aware of their need to do this work. What we said to them is, first of all, we want to minimise disruption. So when you're looking at this, bear in mind what we're doing in terms of Egypt. You don't want to see people being disrupted twice if that's not necessary to do that. So they should be aware of the fact of our plans for Egypt. So the timing of that may well be affected by what they can do to make it less disruptive, if you follow what I mean. If they realise that Egypt's happening and they have to do this work as well, you know, why close a tunnel, you know, twice, for example, if that was the case, if it's possible to do it once. So the timing will be affected by that. But in relation to both Winchborough and what we know at this stage about the slab track proposals at Queen Street, I don't know if there's anything more you want to say on that.
Yes, in terms of the station work, I think that challenge to see what work can be done within the station and around Egypt at the same time as the tunnel closure to minimise the disruptions, a key thing that Network Rail are working through with stakeholders just to minimise that passenger disruption. In terms of Winchborough tunnel, there's been some initial work looking at timescales and whether, in terms of passenger disruption, it's better to do the two at the same time or to do them separately. The initial conclusion of that work seemed to suggest that disruption would be less overall if they're done at separate times due to the resilience of the overall network and the wider impacts. But that's still being worked through by the industry to come up with a solution that minimises the disruption overall. Phase 1 of Egypt has a cost-benefit ratio of 0.7, and now that's lower than any other Scottish Government-backed transport project. Are you able to explain why you think that's gone ahead at that cost-benefit ratio, and if that is best use of Scottish Government capital funding?
Yeah, I think it's true to say that we have to try and take, if you like, a longer-term view on the improvement of our infrastructure. And first of all, we believe, I think it's fairly self-evident if you take individual aspects like Haymarket Station had to be upgraded. I think the second oldest station in Scotland. We think it's fairly obvious that Queen Street Station has to be upgraded with the constraints which are there. But more importantly, on the track itself, we think electrification stands on its own merits, both in terms of the increased efficiency which you can get, the lesser environmental damage which is done through electrification, and the increased reliability of the services. So we think these things are public good things to do in their own right. It's not always easy to attribute the benefit to them beyond the financial benefit. There are other benefits, some of which I've just mentioned, which arise from these. And if you go back to our rail consultation process, if we were to apply the cost-benefit ratio in the way that's described, there's a big campaign to save stations in Glasgow and elsewhere which weren't under threat, but there was campaigns for that, and people campaigning for those things recognised that although it might not produce a cost-benefit ratio in terms of monetary return, nearly all the rail services in Scotland are subsidised. There is a public good in having that. So That's the basis for us taking forward. And I've not heard a serious suggestion that we shouldn't be taking forward the Egypt programme to this point anyway. So we think it stands on its own merits. And maybe it's worth looking at the cost-benefit ratio for the whole of the Egypt process as well to see what that comes up with.
Obviously, with phase 2, that cost-benefit ratio starts to justify itself. So, with that in mind, are you able to give any firm information on phase 2 in terms of scope, costs, or expected delivery dates?
Well, what we've said is some specific points. For example, we'll continue to have 100 kilometres of rail in Scotland electrified every year after we finish phase 1 Egypt. But future phases, including the connectivity with Edinburgh Gateway Station, the 6 trains per hour via Falkirk could be delivered through that. But decisions regarding the timing and the specification of those future phases will take account of both wider capacity, including the capacity to fund these things, and the demand requirements of the rail network. We've seen a substantial increase up to about 83 million passengers journeys per year now. If we continue to see that demand, which is also part of the reason for Egypt, of course, because projecting forward demand, we know we're going to need more capacity on that line. So it will depend on future control periods, and as you'll know, the funding for future control periods is quite a convoluted process as things currently stand. So you have this iterative process whereby Network Rail will say what we think we want to be done. Network Rail will say this will be the cost of it. The ORR will step in and they'll say no, you can do it for this much. And also before that you have things, lovely acronyms like HLOS and SOFA, the Statement of Funds Allocated. So it's quite a convoluted process to go through before we prescribe exactly what we want to see in the next control period, which will be when subsequent phases of Egypt will be considered. And we're not in a position to be more specific. Other than that, well, that's the one that springs to my mind, is 100 kilometres. Is there anything else you'd want to add to that, Aidan?
No, I suppose that's right. And I guess the only other thing I'd bring in is also just the business case around high speed between Edinburgh and Glasgow as well, and the phased approach to Egypt, allowing a strategic decision to be made about the next intervention, both in terms of capacity and journey time improvements between Edinburgh and Glasgow. So that's also a relevant consideration and an opportunity presented by the phased approach.
If a high-speed rail between Glasgow and Edinburgh goes ahead, I take it that will mean that phase 2 of Egypt won't?
Well, it would mean it would be different, as it will have an impact on phase 1 potentials. We'll factor in the possibilities of potential for a high-speed rail link, even into some of the planning for phase 1. We don't want to have any abortive expenditure, but yes, it would look different if that was to go ahead.
Finally, Minister, just if you're able to tell the committee why you felt it best to leave the procurement of the Egypt train fleet to the next franchise holder. Just your thoughts around that, and would it not have been better for yourselves to take forward that exercise so that the fleet meets needs of passengers rather than perhaps the franchisee?
Yeah, I mean, I think that question does, point up the fact there were at least two different ways that you could have done this, and understand that point. I would say that the actual process which is followed, in this case it will be by the franchise holder, will be remarkably similar to the same process that we would have followed had we procured them directly. But it's a central element of the ITT for the franchise, and it contains very detailed specification for the Egypt trains, and that, we believe, ensures that the interests of passengers are taken on board from the very start. So the specification which we've had in the ITT, and it's on Transport Scotland's website if you want to have a look at it, does allow us to protect the passengers in the way that you're describing, and we think that is a more cost-effective way to do it, to give the franchise holder the opportunity to come forward with, it may well be they could procure rolling stock from different sources and at a better rate than we could, especially if they're doing it in conjunction with the actual franchise itself. So we decided that was the best route to go, but we don't think it in any way diminishes the benefit to passengers. In fact, it may increase the benefits.
Adam, you want to ask some questions about Stirling, Allowick and Cardinal?
Yes, thanks, Convener. The Scotsman reported last October, Minister, that this railway line would need to be substantially rebuilt at a cost of £17 million. And that's just 5 years after its opening. The suggestion is that poor design, perhaps, was what has resulted in this need for substantial overhaul. Can you provide an update on the repair work required to the railway line, its possible effect on passenger and freight services, and who will be liable to meet these repair costs?
Well, just to take on the last point first, it's Network Rail's obligation to maintain the track and the infrastructure, even though in this case they didn't construct it, although I do remember in their previous garages rail track, they were the people that put up the stag appraisals and were very involved in providing the work, which allowed us to, when I say us, it was the council, so a small council with no real expertise at all took the lead in relation to this and relied very heavily on those in the industry. And as you say, that's meant that the track condition seems to have deteriorated much more quickly than would be anticipated. So there are speed restrictions which are there now, and they're having a negative effect on journey times, both in relation to freight and passenger services. Network Rail have already undertaken essential major renewals of the track bed and drainage between 21st of February and 3rd of March. And they're going to continue doing that. There's been some disruption, it's in my constituency, it's on the Kennet side just now, and there'll be some disruption at the Cambus element as well. And that will include them completely digging out and replacing the track. And existing steel sleepers will be replaced with concrete ones. The ORR, to go back to the point about funding, the ORR, Office of Rail Regulation and Network Rail are working with industry partners to finalise the cost of remedial works. And the costs will be met by Network Rail, although they're funded from overall budgets in Scotland, which are determined by the ORR, and to which we obviously contribute.
Is there anything else you want to say about that, given that you've been intimately involved in that particular railway line?
Well, I would say that I was intimately involved in the proposal. Obviously, it sounds very convenient to say I was involved at the start, but not at the bit when the building works took place. We, as you may recall, as a council, in fact, I proposed it was going to be the first private bill this Parliament heard to have the line. I think it ended up being the second one. So we're very keen to have that. We were most concerned with passenger services Stirling to Alloa, but we were told at the time by the then Scottish Executive, with some justification, you really had to have the freight element as well. And I think that may be, from what I've read, some of the cause of some of the problems. The freight trains which are carrying coal to Longannet are substantially heavier than were anticipated, and that may have caused more pressure. And like your own area, Clackmannanshire is known for its mine workings, and maybe there's softer ground there. I'm not sure of that, but so we had got that through to the permission stage in 2003, when sadly we lost control of administration. It was taken on by somebody else, and the construction started there afterwards. It was completed in 2008, so we have to take responsibility for that. And of course, the government would have been involved in overseeing that, but it was done through TIE, if you remember that organisation. In any event, it's a problem that's there and it has to be fixed. It's absolutely vital to the Scottish economy. The coal going to the power station is extremely important, not to mention people being able to use what's turned out to be an extremely successful passenger link between Stirling and Alloa. So the work has been undertaken by Network Rail.
Okay, you mentioned in your opening statement, Minister, the problems at the Rest and Be Thankful on the A83, which seem to be in news bulletins on a very regular basis, especially when there's been heavy rain. And you mentioned the diversionary route being opened. Each time there's a slip, we hear that engineers and surveyors are looking at the hillside to see whether there are likely to be more slips. Is this just going to be an ongoing problem, or is there a case for just, I don't know, blasting away bits of the hillside?
Well, nature's doing its job in relation to the hillside in any event, I think, Convener. But I think the underlying point is, no, we can't guarantee and mitigate absolutely against all landslips. And that's not just true at the Rest and Be Thankful, it's true in the rest of Scotland, and even looking at the news this week in Washington State, some of the things which have happened there. But also in other parts of Europe, in the Alps and so on, where they have landslips. fairly regularly as well. So what we've tried to do is to make sure we can mitigate the effects. And one of the worst effects, well, the obvious worst effect is safety. So that's why we've gone with this progressive installation of netting at the rest itself. And what you won't hear about, as you say, you hear about this every time. What you don't hear about is the times when the netting has caught landslips. So safety is the first thing. But the second thing, the biggest frustration for people in the wider area is the diversionary route, which was around, I think, a 50-mile route. And also the perception that that might mean that Argyll's not open for business, which it is. So we've concentrated on those two things to make sure we've got as much coverage as possible to mitigate any slips, and that's working progressively and it's working well. The other side is so people can get by. I mean, the diversionary route, which I used myself recently, is a major improvement for many people. We had an awful lot of positive comment about that, which would not tend to hit the headlines about people perhaps being delayed by 15 minutes instead of having to take a 50-mile detour. However, it's clear there is still work to be done, and some of the slips which have happened have been over the other side of the rest, and we're working on that side as well to see if we can mitigate that. I've had recent meetings to look at additional planting as well, which has been mentioned before, but you really have to have the proper basis for undertaking that work, which might help to more stabilise the slope there. And just to point out that last time that we had the slip, it wasn't the slip itself, which was not a huge slip, which was most disruptive. It was the fact there was this house-sized rock which could come straight down onto the road, and in fact could have come down onto the rest and then right down to the old military road. And I got the chance to go up in a helicopter and see the size of it and the guys that were working on it in pretty difficult circumstances. And what you do have is nature. You can see when you get that close to all the different gullies, which they'll tell you that they can't tell you whether that happened 3 years ago or 3,000 years ago, some of these gullies. So obviously there's a history of the land slipping down. So we're concentrating on mitigating, minimising the impact on people and stabilising the slope as best we can. Those are the things that we're taking forward in relation to.
Okay, thanks. You also mentioned the major trunk road projects, Bailston to Newhouse, the AWPR and the dualling of the A9, and I understand they're all currently in the procurement stage. Are they going to be phased, or are they all going to be happening at the same time, and are the same sort of same companies bidding for these contracts?
I think they're neither being phased nor all happening exactly at the same time. There is overlap between them all. AWPR, as I say, completed by spring 2018. The M8 bundle, I think 2017 was the date that I'd mentioned for that. Obviously the A9 and A96 are longer term, 2025 on the one hand, 2030. So a lot of them will be happening concurrently. And that's because that's the earliest time we can get to doing these. We are looking in relation to the A9 to see how we can accelerate some of that if it's at all possible. But I would say that even thinking about it just now, the A9 11 years from now being completed, that's a pretty tight timescale to do the things that you have to do, especially once you've broken it down into different phases. And as you'll know, going through the process of consultation, design, procurement, road orders, which can be challenged legally, as we've seen. So that is actually quite a tight timescale, although we expect to have at least 50% of it completed and dualled by 2022. And we are open to the looking all the time at how we can bring that forward. So these things are happening progressively, and I think, if you go to 2025 or 2030, you then see every city in Scotland connected by motorway or dual carriageway, and a major change, especially in relation to the AWPR, which I know you're familiar with yourself, Convener, absolutely crucial to the economy of the North East, been talked about for I think over 50 years, and it should have been completed many years ago, but we will get to that and get it completed by 2018. We'd like to have had that done earlier, of course, but for the legal action. But there's each one of these major trunk road projects is proceeding at the pace that's necessary to complete it, rather than looking at what other ones are happening at that time.
Thanks. And you mentioned various parts of the road network throughout Scotland that were getting major resurfacing and upgrading. There was a report recently about the lines on roads in a deteriorating state. Is there anything being done about that?
Yes, I mean that's kept. The A9 is a very specific example in relation to that, where we've looked at signing and lining specifically in terms of additional safety impact. But all the roads, all the trunk roads certainly, and we only control 4% of the roads in Scotland. 4% are trunk roads, 96% local roads. All of those are constantly looked at in terms of what additional signage requires. I think the report which you mentioned comes out, I think, every year, and it's by people involved in the business of providing those services, and they've made this case before. It is, of course, a reminder to us to make sure that we have to do it, but I don't know if David wants to say more about that.
No, just the point the Minister makes, particularly in terms of white lining, there have been various parts of the network. It's been pointed out to us that white lines either have eroded or been worn off, as is naturally the case, and that those are being replaced on a progressive basis.
Even when the road's resurfaced, you can wait months and months before the white lining is replaced on those roads. I mean, why can't it be done as part of the resurfacing project?
I don't think you should have to wait months and months, and I think you do. There is some extent. I've just mentioned the fact that we only control 4% of the roads. That's still an awful lot of road, and it's in fact the most valuable asset that Scottish ministers have is the road network in Scotland. So we do rely on others sometimes coming forward. It should be, if it's been resurfaced, there should be an automatic follow-on to that to go and replace the siding and lining which is there. But if it doesn't happen, we do rely on other agencies and sometimes individuals saying to us, I mean, I had one recently on the M9 which I use fairly regularly, saying this part of the road has been eroded, and that's something that prompts action, should prompt action from our contractors.
Thanks. If we move on to active travel, Jim?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Can you provide the committee with an update on the National Walking Strategy, the development of which was announced in May 2012? What further progress has been made since that announcement, and what specific resources have been committed to the rollout of the strategy?
Well, first of all, one of the resources is time, and I've met recently with those involved in putting the strategy together, I think on 2, maybe 3 occasions in the last month. The strategy itself is currently with the working group, which is a range of national partners, and the working group was established in support of the strategy development. The strategy will be redrafted based on the responses of the different partners and submitted to the Minister for Commonwealth Games and Sport before going out for a targeted stakeholder consultation. So it's due to be published in June this year. And the public opinion survey on walking that was undertaken by Paths for All, who are obviously very key partners in relation to this, and Living Street Scotland in 2009 has also been rerun, or rewalked, if you prefer. And that will provide a baseline that will be used along with stats on walking from national data. So there's a lot of resource being put into it by the different partners, and as I say, we expect to publish that in June 2014.
Okay, clearly from what you've said, there's been quite an extensive period of consultation. Is there a budget committed to the strategy, in addition to the time resource that you've mentioned?
Well, I've mentioned the budget that we've increased in relation to active travel generally, and that shouldn't be assumed that's always to do with cycling, which is sometimes the assumption. That will often include improved footpaths, which are for walking as well. I mean, in my own area between Alva and Tillicountry, the new path that's been put in there is both for cyclists and for walkers. So the active travel budget supports walking in as much as it supports cycling. And just to say an example being the Leith Walk route, one reason I felt able to commit to the government putting £3.6 million into that is to make sure, and I've made clear, that the eventual design by the council should recognise the needs of walkers, and that means things like not just decent surfaces, but being able to walk in safety. So if you want to go from Waverley Station down to Victoria Quay or Ocean Terminal, you can do so in safety. So the resource that we've applied to active travel, and we're always looking to try and increase that, applies to walking as it does to cycling. But what I've also said to Ian, that's on the group from Paths for All, is that additional walking things which we can do, which might, he suggested us using the same process, the local links process that we've used for some cycling routes. If they come forward with proposals for that, which, as I mentioned before, can be very beneficial, although sometimes smaller scale than these big projects we've talked about, it can be very beneficial to the local economy, we're willing to look at that. And so I meet with 3 other ministers, sport, environment and education, fairly regularly to see what we can do to enhance that, and walking is part of it. But the resources applied to it are those which I've mentioned in relation to active travel.
That's helpful, Minister. Can I ask you specifically about cycling? You'll know my own interest in this issue from previous evidence sessions. The Government's commitment to and ambition and target for 10% of all journeys to be made by bicycle by 2020. We heard in previous evidence to this committee that, a consensus from all of the cycling organisations, including Sustrans, Cycling Scotland and Spokes, that this target simply could not be met without further additional investment in cycling infrastructure. Now, since that evidence, there have been a number of very positive announcements from the government, which you referred to in your opening remarks. But do you accept that cycling infrastructure is key to this, and can you tell us if you're still on target to meet the target outlined in the Cycling Action Plan for Scotland?
Yeah, I should say, first of all, it's neither a target nor the Scottish Government's. I mean, what we're trying to achieve is something that's undertaken jointly with all the different partners. That's what the Cycling Action Plan is about. It's not just the government's. So it relies very much on different stakeholders, not least, in fact, perhaps most obviously, local governments. So they've never expressed it as a target in that way, and it's not the government's to meet or otherwise. It's for all of us to try and achieve. And I think you're right in the way that you relate the concerns of some in the cycling world, if you like, about our ability, given current progress, to meet that by 2020. And that is why we've put the additional money into active travel. That's why we've had the National Cycling Network. That's why we've, the group I mentioned, the cross-portfolio group that's been discussing these issues, is trying to look at how we can get more resource into this as well. We understand the point about infrastructure. The experience has been, certainly the Dutch experience has been very much that do it right the first time, because they made, as they're bound to do if you're leaders in this field, many mistakes on the way to where they are now. So we're trying to make sure that's done in that way, and that's why the £3.6 million, for example, for the Leith Walk project is not just for its own benefits, but to be an example to other parts of the country as to how you can progress these things. So we understand the concerns out there, but I think we have taken quite a number of measures to increase the pace, and that's not the end of the story. We'll continue to push for that.
That's helpful. The Scottish Government did publish the Cycling Action Plan for Scotland with this shared ambition for 10% of all journeys to be met by 2020. Are we on target to meet that?
We know that we are sitting around 2% just now. In some areas there's been quite dramatic improvements. In other areas, generally across the piece, not as much as we'd like to see. But if it's the case that, for example, infrastructure is key to this, and we believe it's a vital part of it, then that will take some time for it to follow through. I mentioned earlier, in my own area, there's 2 links which have been put, which will almost complete the national cycle network. In fact, a more local cycle network in Clackmannanshire as well, a small council having done that. There are many other examples across the country. Glasgow doing some very interesting things on cycling. So I think there is a degree of alacrity with which the different partners are attacking this, and our intention is to try and get to that 10%. It's it's a social good apart from the good it does for individuals as well. So that's we're pushing as hard as we can do to do that. And we realise we've started from a low base, certainly in relation to countries like Denmark and the Netherlands. But that's what we're intending to do. We're trying to get to that level of cycling take-up.
I recognise your own personal commitment to increasing investment in cycling infrastructure, and note the comments you made earlier about the disproportionate economic impact that these investments can have in local communities, particularly in rural areas, and also that this can bring about the step change in behaviour. When you spoke at the cycling conference in Glasgow last year, and I am paraphrasing, but you said something along the lines of, once the government has completed the major transport infrastructure investment projects to which it is currently committed, there will be further opportunities in the future to look at what more can be done to invest in cycling. Can you say a little bit more about that?
I think what I was saying specifically is going back to the point I made previously about the fact that our transport infrastructure is, it's suffered from decades of underinvestment. I've said that. The UK government has said that. In fact, they've said that about the wider UK network as well. I wouldn't say it's necessarily true of the South East and London in particular, but it's true of much of the rest of the UK. So we're starting from that base, and if you do that, you end up having to try and catch up. So just on that one point about having our cities connected by motorways and dual carriageways, those are big projects. The A9 should have been done decades ago, but it's the economic spine of the country, and we will have to undertake that. I believe the M74 was essential. I believe the AWPR is absolutely essential. But it can't be the case that we go on after those projects, continue looking for the next big project like that. I think there has to be, and I don't think it is the case that we have to wait until these are completed. I think what you should see is a transport budget which starts to concentrate more and more, as I think we're starting to do now, on, first of all, active travel, but secondly, on maintaining to the highest standard possible the network that we have. So in relation to roads, which are very important for cyclists as well as for cars and buses, in roads, you know about the backlog in terms of maintenance, which Audit Scotland have shown up. I think we have to try and get all the roads into the correct condition as well. So I think over time, the budget's going to have to be much more reflective of those two other priorities, active travel and proper maintenance to a very high standard, and less in future about the big projects once we've done these things which are vital to the economy. That's the point I was trying to make. I don't think I said further costs would have to wait until that had happened. I kind of tried to point out the fact that over time you could start to see the active travel budget taking up a bigger share, and also the roads maintenance, and not just roads maintenance but rail maintenance taking up a bigger share as well, and not always the bigger projects.
Okay, if we move on to Ferries Minister, can you tell us whether I think it was 2 ferries that you commissioned from Ferguson's on the Clyde, the delivery has been on time and on budget, and whether there are any proposals for further renewal of the ferries fleet?
Yes, well, they haven't been on time, the ferries. The second one is still obviously under construction just now. So there was some these were very different types of ferries. They were hybrid ferries, which were quite a radical departure. The first one has been in service for some time, and it's proven to be even more attractive than we anticipated in terms of the savings and its reliability, partly powered by batteries as well as by traditional fuel. And the second one is coming up behind that, and some of the lessons from the first one are being learnt from the second one. However, we're doing more than that. Of course, we'll shortly see it may have happened last week, it would be this week, the naming or launching ceremony for the MV Seaforth, which is the replacement vessel for Liverpool to Stornoway, which replaces both the passenger and freight vessel that currently run on that route. Much more efficient in terms of fuel usage. And what we laid out in the ferries plan was a process over time whereby we renew these capital investments. However, I've also said that I think to make it attractive for people to undertake that kind of investment, whether it's a government or different companies, and you'll know that the vessels which we have which service the Northern Isles are leased, I think, from RBS, so they're not owned by the Scottish Government. But to make that kind of investment more attractive, we really should have longer ferry contracts. Currently the 6-year contract, you don't have that for bus, you don't have that for train. So we've made representations to the European Commission on a number of occasions. I think with some likelihood of success, we'll see some loosening of the regulations around that. And obviously, if you're somebody that's going to invest in ferries, you know the contract's going to last for 12 years rather than 6, and it makes it more attractive. But we do need to replace our ferries. I think we made a big start to that. We're still looking at the issue of other sources. Hydrogen-powered ferries, there have been some, at least one I know of down south. And over and above that, you've got the issue of the sulphur regulations which come in from next year as well, which are going to require work on the existing ferry fleet if they're going to comply with those regulations. So there's a lot of work to be done in relation to that. And of course, just as with the MV Seaforth, which I mentioned, it's not just a case of getting a new ferry. You have to carry out improvements and changes at the 2 ports which service that ferry so they can accommodate it. So those are the things that we're concentrating on just now.
Alex, did you want to come in?
Yes. I was going to ask the Minister if he would like to take the opportunity at this stage to give us an update on the tendering process for the Clyde and Hebridean ferries, whether there's a set timescale now and any other information there might be at this early stage.
Well, just that we're at this early stage, and I know that the potential bidders, and who knows who the bidders might be, but they're already starting to turn their mind to that, as are the officials starting to have that discussion and engagement about the actual process. I think Mr Johnson will know from previous discussions that we've said it's not our intention to unbundle the service, so it will be a service more or less complete. We have said that the one thing we are willing to consider are small-scale community-based services which might be advocated. And we still have an ongoing process with different councils whereby they may wish to have their current services provided by them taken on board by the government and included within that contract. So, as you say, we're at an early stage with that, but the discussions are ongoing and the officials are working on the timetable for that now.
When might we expect the process to be completed? Do we have a sort of ballpark figure for when that date might be?
Yes, it was, I think it was a 3-year extension from the previous deadline, so which was, I think, 2012. So 2015-16, I think, is when we're looking to see the new contract in place.
Thank
you. If we move on to bus accessibility, when this committee was out in Dumbarton as part of Parliament Day, I met Douglas Gilroy of the Scottish Accessible Transport Alliance, and he was saying that he'd had discussions with you on the potential of creating a forum or group which could advise on bus accessibility policy issues. And he made a very valid point, I thought, that bus accessibility needs to be discussed when the buses are being constructed, before buses are constructed, and it really needs a conversation with the likes of Alexander Dennis on bus accessibility issues before the buses are even built. So I wonder what your thoughts were on that, and whether there should be a forum to consider bus accessibility issues.
Well, we believe, I think, that we've already got the forum that can do that through the bus stakeholder group, which I think we now have a member. I'd have to check that, whether it's happened as yet, from Max. So somebody that's got a specific remit in terms of people with disabilities and making sure that accessibility is taken into account. Yes, in fact, we have. It's got the convener of Max. Actually, the group is meeting today and discussing a range of issues to do with accessibility, and that includes provision of passenger information on and off the bus, wheelchair access, complaints handling and bus stop design. I should say, I think as you'll know, Convener, that accessibility issues are reserved issues in terms of design of buses. Disability groups, though, have requested of us more audio-visual systems to be provided on buses. As I say, that legislation is reserved to Westminster, but we are happy to take on board the points which are made and pass them on and make representations to Westminster. I've said that to Max when I met with them recently. There's been a call to develop a basic disability awareness training package for drivers. Again, that's a reserved area, and DFT currently are making use of a number of exemptions concerning the right of passengers in bus and coach transport. It is true that large operators already provide disability awareness training, and that may be an area where Max, as I mentioned, could help to improve on that training. So we believe that the bus stakeholder group, which does have a wider remit than just the accessibility issues, but all the, for example, CPT, which represents all the, or most of the bus providers, are on that group as well. So we think that's a good interface to take forward these issues. But as things currently stand, in terms of design and the legal framework, it's a reserved issue, so we can make representations on that just now.
Thanks. Alex, you've got some questions on high-speed rail and East Coast Main Line.
We talked, you've already spoken at some length about the Edinburgh-Glasgow connection and the possible inclusion of high-speed rail in that. But when we look at high-speed rail, and particularly the HS2 project, it's becoming a bit of a political hot potato south of the border, not least in the parliamentary constituencies where the new line would have to go through. So while I think we're seeing the project becoming more accepted in terms of a direction of travel, if you'll excuse the expression, it's becoming politically somewhat less predictable than it was before. Are you able to engage in that process, and what communication do you have with the UK government on their plans and their expectations?
Yes, we do engage. We've had a number of discussions at ministerial level, but we have had the agreement now that we'll have at official level the engagement with the HS2, which has been taken forward by Aidan and his team. And that is looking at things like potentially routes and costs and so on. I think the point that you make is a very good one about the more confused kind of public perception of the politics behind this. I mentioned earlier on the Stirling, Alnwick and Carden line. Now, we had made a bid for that as a small council, and the costs went substantially up at one stage to, I think, from 23 to 37 million pounds. And at that point, people said, well, this is worth the candle, we're not going to get involved in this. And what we had to do, again, as a small council, was demonstrate a much wider benefit than that which had been demonstrated before, the economic benefit. So it included, for example, things like taking freight, as it did, off the Forth Bridge. I know that sounds a bit obscure for Stirling to Alloa and to Kincardine, but that meant that you were freeing up a great deal of capacity in the Forth Bridge for the wider Scottish economy. And the point I'm making is we had to make a bigger economic case to justify that expenditure, which we did, and that's why we got it back when it was looking like it wasn't going to happen. And I think the same thing is true of high-speed rail. If they can demonstrate a bigger case for it, because you're getting people within your own party, you're getting people within the Parliamentary Labour Party, but not so much in the Parliamentary local government Labour Party, who are very strongly committed to it, including Glasgow and Edinburgh and Birmingham. To try and allay some of these fears and to make sure that we get some kind of unity, because it will stretch over a number of different administrations, I think you've got to make the strongest possible case. And I'm not just saying it, I think we can back it up with evidence. The strongest possible case is that HS, high-speed rail, comes to Scotland. It's better in terms of modal shift. You have a sub 3 hour time, so people will go by train rather than by plane. In terms of the environmental benefits, in terms of the economic benefits, Scotland and the central belt of Scotland is the second most active part of the economically active part of the UK after the south east. So there are benefits. The benefits are much greater if it comes to Scotland, and I think that helps make a better case, and it might allay some of the fears that we have in some parts of other parties about that. So on that, we have repeatedly said that, and what we're very encouraged by is David Higgins, who's now taken this over, saying, you know, first of all, you don't have to start at point A and work to point B. You can start in the north. We've said from the start you can start from Scotland. You mentioned some of the difficulties in relation to parliamentary constituencies. Now, we don't have anything like that level of contention. We may have more when we fix upon a route, I understand that point, but we don't have anything like that level of contention, and we think we can actually get a much quicker start to in Scotland going south. And the Borders Railway is being constructed along its length. It's not starting in the Borders and coming to Edinburgh. So those are some of the things that are being discussed, but we do have a working process between Transport Scotland and the DFT. We have the Fast Track Scotland document, which you've seen before, which called for the remit of the HS2 company to be extended to include the detailed planning of high-speed rail to Scotland. We've pursued this with the government. I was pleased to welcome Baroness Kramer to Scotland, who was accompanied by Alistair Carmichael. And I did make the point to Alistair Carmichael that his job really should be to represent the interests of Scotland in the Cabinet. And if he's doing that, I think he should be proposing and advocating very strongly high-speed rail, an explicit statement. We support high-speed rail coming to Scotland. The previous government didn't do it. The current government has still not done it, even though we are grateful for the fact we're now working with them on this area. But let's just have an explicit commitment and say high-speed rail should come to Scotland. It doesn't really matter, in one sense, what the constitutional setup is. It's beneficial to both areas if we do this. So let's get on and do it.
You said earlier that the timescale for the development of high-speed rail between Edinburgh and Glasgow may be influenced to some extent by the pace of development of high-speed rail, or HS2 effectively. There was a recent proposal that suggesting that the high-speed HS2 might be taken forward more quickly for a number of reasons, but including the fact that it might actually reduce the cost. Would any advancement to the HS2 project give you difficulty in relation to the Edinburgh-Glasgow project?
I don't think I did say that. I think what I was saying before was that the high-speed rail project between Edinburgh and Glasgow should be taken into account with what we're doing with Egypt and other projects. But no, I don't think it would give us difficulty, given the timescales that we've outlined when this could be done. I think it would present opportunities, in fact, because if we say, it's almost, if you like, a statement of our intent that we're serious about high-speed rail. And obviously, if you ended up with a situation of services splitting in a Y going to Edinburgh and Glasgow, you have to make that part in the middle work between Edinburgh and Glasgow. There's also merits in its own right, because it frees up a lot of capacity on that route, such that other traffic, slower moving traffic, not as fast as the high-speed rail, can be used for other points away from Edinburgh and Glasgow. So it has its own merits, but yes, I think it would be bolstered by, and it might help encourage the development of high-speed rail to Scotland if people see that we are serious about it and we are doing it. I don't know if it was behind your question that we would have to hurry up very quickly and do this even more quickly if we had a commitment to high-speed rail to Scotland, but I don't think that's the case. I don't know if you want to say more than that, Aidan.
I think that's absolutely right. And the timescales that as I think it's assuming you're referring to Sir David Higgins' report around timescales. So he's proposing an accelerated timetable to Crewe for 2026 and Manchester for 2030. So these are still a long way off. So in terms of the timescales and the feasibility of doing a high-speed link between Edinburgh and Glasgow, there's nothing around that would cause any undue pressure in terms of the technical feasibility. I think, as the Minister says, the economic, we're working out through the business case, but it stands to reason that the earlier that high speed comes to Scotland, the stronger the business case for that Edinburgh-Glasgow link would be, given the opportunity of that north-south connection as well as east-west connection.
On a different but perhaps related subject, could I ask if the Minister has a view on the proposal by GNER to run an open access service between London and Edinburgh, which, including some signalling improvements, could show a substantial reduction in journey time, and one that could actually deliver journey times between Edinburgh and London almost as effectively as the use of the high-speed rail, proposed high-speed rail service?
Yes, I mean, I think on that last point, though, it's worth saying that high-speed rail is I know we do fall into the trap of talking about high-speed rail and journey times, but it's a bit much more than that. The capacity is vitally important, and as I said before, if you don't have high-speed rail coming to Scotland, even before you've completed the high-speed HS2 current proposals, you're going to have to invest billions in the West Coast Main Line because it will have reached its capacity by 2024 in any event. So high-speed rail is a bit more than journey times, but I think that you're right to point to journey times. And the GNER proposals, we have had discussions with them, and we are pleased with the fact that different stakeholders looking to try to improve journey times to Scotland. We had initial discussions, they've had initial discussions with all the bidders for Intercity East Coast, the East Coast franchise, and they've outlined a requirement for faster journey times between Edinburgh and London. It's good that it's been recognised more and more. There's also some very interesting proposals from other parties in terms of cross-border services, so we'll continue to talk to them without favour. Of course, I would imagine you'd listen to us much more earnestly if after the 18th of September we're going to have responsibility for these services. It's currently the responsibility of the DFT, and it's been a struggle even to get to the stage where we're allowed to be consulted in terms of the East Coast Main Line, even though these are services coming straight into Scotland. But yes, we'll continue to have that dialogue, and we're pleased that people are putting that emphasis on journey times, not least because of, as I've said before, you can start to get real modal shift if you can drive those journey times down.
Are you comfortable with the idea of a company, admittedly a company with a good track record, coming in on a strictly commercial basis and providing a service that will link London to Edinburgh in the way proposed?
Well, we have no choice in that as things stand just now anyway. It's not for us to agree it or disagree it. We can make our views known, and also it's pretty much the same as with franchising. That's what the current situation is. It sometimes it's not a cheap option, it's not cost effective, it's convoluted, but that's the current environment in which we work in. All we do is say, taking it on its merits, that it seems to be concentrating on reducing journey times. We're supportive of that, and we've said that to them.
I was nearly finished there, but the Minister's last answer tempted me to come back again. You speculated about what might happen after the 18th of September. Well, in that post-18th of September environment, would the Minister be inclined then to support a purely commercial free access rail service between Edinburgh and London?
Well, I think our emphasis, as I've mentioned already, would be on trying to get high-speed rail and the infrastructure improvements which are required. But there is a process to go through. The member's quite right on the cross-border services which are currently there. So we'll be looking to very early discussions from the 19th of September as to how we can properly maximise these. I mean, there are some decisions which seem to us to be quite strange, and there are some decisions currently taken by the DFT on cross-border services where we're not even consulted. So I think you see a very different approach. I would say it's worth pointing out as well in that very attractive scenario, which the member points out about the 19th of September, that we will then be committed to the franchise process. So for the vast bulk, about 95% of the services provided in Scotland will be in that process of having franchise for the two franchises. Cross-border services, we'll have to have a discussion with the UK government about that.
I tried.
Okay, if we move on to seatbelts and school buses, Adam, you've got a question.
Yeah, Minister, the UK government has already agreed in principle to transfer powers over school bus safety to the Scottish Government. Can you outline the timetable for this transfer and any plans you have to use these new powers to improve school bus safety in Scotland?
So I think we expect to have the agreement to have the powers transferred next year. I think that's when we expect to have that. What we said, though, is that we think that will take more time for us to actually implement these. So looking for implementation 2018, 2019 and beyond to be complete, and it would be primary school buses would tend to be first and some secondary school services after that. And the reason for that is simply because we don't want to have the burden on local authorities maximised, whereby they have to end existing contracts, insist on new types of vehicles at that stage at a substantial expense. So, as they've done in Wales, what we said is if we give this longer lead-in time, it allows councils to organise their contracts and also potential bidders to organise their stock of vehicles to make sure that they'll be ready to comply with that when it happens. And that seems to have worked well in Wales, and that's why we're following this approach here.
So in terms of the actual improved safety, what elements are you particularly keen to introduce?
Well, it's specifically in relation to the provision of seat belts for every child on a school bus, so dedicated school bus transport. There are other issues which have been before the Public Petitions Committee in terms of signage and so on as well, and we're not saying we're not willing to look at that, but this power that we've asked for from the UK Government is specifically around the ability to prescribe in law that any dedicated school bus transport must have a seat belt for every child, in the same way as Aberdeenshire Council have managed already.
And Gordon, the trams.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener. And yeah, I want to ask you a number of questions about the Edinburgh Tram project. At long last, it looks like we're going to have trams fully operational by May 2014. Yeah. Can you provide an update on Transport Scotland's involvement in the delivery of the tram project in getting to this point?
Certainly, I think the member knows that the government has been the principal funder, maybe a reluctant funder, but principal funder of the project. We've committed £500 million to it. And since mediation, do you remember the mediation process had to be gone through, which Transport Scotland and one or two individuals within Transport Scotland played a very productive part to try and get the sides back together. Since that was concluded last summer, Transport Scotland has had a director on the project board, for example, and a small team of Transport Scotland staff working alongside Edinburgh Council staff in key senior roles, and they've used the expertise which they have in larger projects to help. They've not been solely responsible for it, I wouldn't want to say that, but they've managed to help get the programme back to where it should be, in my view. And as you said, you can see the trams on the streets of Edinburgh now, empty, albeit apart from that one that went to Murrayfield with 1,000 folk, or the 1,000 folk that signed up to that. I mean, I do think I should just say that, from the government's point of view, is it may well be, and we certainly hope that the trams are a big success. It was just our view in 2007 that that wasn't the best way to dispense with £750 million, given the other priorities we've had. But now it's coming to the stage where the involvement of Transport Scotland and the Scottish Government will end, and Transport for Edinburgh, the vehicle used upon which the City Council will take over. And we're in that process already with driver training.
Councillors have announced recently that they intend to spend £1 million on additional works to take account of the possibility of the tram line being extended in future down to Leith. Now, the legislation passed in 2006 required any work to commence within 15 years. What are your views on the possibility of the tram line being extended down to Leith within this time frame?
well, 15 years would take you through to 2022, and I've no idea whether I'll be doing this job in 2022, but or whether it'll be obviously this party in government. But we've made clear that we funded that. We funded the line that's there just now to the tune of £500 million, not a penny more, and we've stuck to that. And we have no intention of being involved in further lines for trams. The council, of course, can take that forward if they want to do that themselves. I can understand some of the attractions. Leith Walk is a long boulevard down which they could go and access different businesses, but once again, it's not something that the Scottish Government would want to take forward. We've said the same thing, incidentally, to other proposals which there have been for trams. Obviously, we are willing to consider the tram trains, a different light rail system for Glasgow. We're looking at that, but we don't intend to be involved in those, or certainly not funding those future phases.
And that was going to be my last question, just to clarify. So that, you know, the Scottish Government has contributed 500 million to the 776 million that the project's costing. So if there was to be any extension down to Leith, it would basically be dependent on Edinburgh taxpayers picking up the tab for that, effectively. Is that what we're saying?
Well, councils have different ways in which they can fund these things, as I know you're aware, but all I'm saying is, from the government's point of view, we have no intention, we have no plans to make any contribution to any, and certainly I've not had a proposal from the City Council to look at this. So the government doesn't have any intention of putting more resources into further tram phases.
And my final question is on a slightly different topic. You mentioned in your opening remarks the success of the Community Transport Vehicle Fund. And you highlighted that it had been oversubscribed with 130 applications totaling 4.1 million. Given that there is this unmet demand, and what plans do you have to replicate the fund in future years, if any?
I think we were very clear and honest at the time that it was a one-year deal, and we managed to find the resources within that year to fund that. And it was the central recommendation, I think, of this committee. It was the thing which was most strongly represented to you from the different stakeholders. So we did that. We found £1 million. Obviously, if we were able to do it again in future, we'd have to try and identify those funds. And obviously, budget discussions over resources are ongoing all of the time. But we continue to fund to a greater extent than we did before. Again, one of this committee's recommendation, the Community Transport Association, which will help them their capacity to make sure they access additional funds. And we also continue to fund local authorities as well. One thing that we were very clear on was that we shouldn't centralise this in any way. The service is often delivered by volunteers, and it's an organic one in many areas, and we didn't want to impose any central kind of control. But we'll always look to see if there's additional support we can provide, and we will look in this year's budget to see if there's anything further that we can do. There's obviously a secondary benefit, which is that not just that they can improve the fleet of buses which they have, but the purchase of these buses helps the economy as well, especially if they're purchased in Scotland.
Okay, thanks very much.
Anyone else got any final question, Alex?
Never miss an opportunity. Given that this committee still has a petition open on the subject, could the Minister give us his current thinking in relation to the junction of the A90 with the A937 at Longskirk?
Well, as has been said before, there's design work going on. David Anderson's been heavily involved in this, but design work is going on in conjunction with Nestrans to look at the best optimal solution for that. We're aware of the public feelings among many people, but Nestrans and ourselves have worked together, and I think the member will know how complex that junction is and the different options which might exist. I think we are duty bound to look at the what the best option would be, also taking into account likely developments close by as well. It's a junction that I use regularly, having two children in Aberdeen and going up to Aberdeen quite regularly. And I'm well aware of some of the concerns that are there. It does have a good safety record since the changes were made there, but I'm still aware of the concerns which have been expressed. So the best thing to me to do, for my mind, is to examine what the best option would be. But it might be worth just hearing, if we can, briefly from David, convener, because he's been heavily involved in that.
The Minister referred to the piece of work that's going on at the moment. That's actually between both ourselves, Nestrans and the Aberdeenshire Council. After all, they have responsibility for the roads that lead into the A90, not only through Lawrence Kirk, We've also been discussions over the course of the last 2 or 3 weeks in public meetings in and around Lawrence Kirk, and there was a discussion even on Monday of this week about options and objective setting, and that included not only Aberdeenshire Council but also Angus Council and the RTPs, to ensure that we actually understood, well, what is this junction really trying to evolve here, such as the Minister says, we come to the right solution rather than necessarily just a reaction to a solution. So that work, we're again hoping to report in the summer of the piece of work that Nestrans are leading. And that has actually, I think it's been very well received in the local area, actually going out and talking to the people in Lawrence Kirk and inviting them to come and say, well, what are the real issues for you in this area? And that's been very helpful in framing our thinking.
I should say, just mention the good safety record since 2005, I think it is. I'm not at all being dismissive of the concerns which there have been on the roads which come to that junction. There have been some serious accidents there. They're not our roads to control, and it hasn't been actually at the junction, it's been on the roads themselves, but we are aware of those, in some cases, tragic accidents, but those are the responsibility for the councils. We can't get involved in those. What we can look at is the conjunction of those local roads with the main road itself, and I think we're proceeding in the right way. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's all the questions, Minister. Can I thank you and your officials very much for your evidence, and we move into private session as previously agreed. We'll have a short comfort break now.